The tragic tale of the Donner Party. The year was 1846. A year that began with hope, promise, and the dream of a new life in the golden lands of California. But for the Donner Party, it would become a nightmare etched in the frozen wastes of the Sierra Nevada. I've been researching the Donner Party for years, but there's something that keeps me coming back. An itch in the back of my mind that I can't quite scratch. You see, there are things about that journey that don't add up. Things that aren't in the history books. What really happened out there? And why does the story seem to be missing something? Let me take you back to the beginning. To the days before the snow fell. Before the hunger gnawed at their bellies like a ravenous beast. They were a group of pioneers, eager to carve out a new life in the West. Families, friends, children, they all set out together, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, were among the leaders of this ill-fated expedition. They were strong men, confident in their abilities to lead their people through the wilderness. The journey was long, the terrain unforgiving, but spirits were high. They had survived the Great Plains, crossed rivers swollen with spring rains, and traversed the deserts that had claimed so many lives before them. But as they approached the Sierra Nevada, the air grew colder, and an ominous sense of foreboding settled over the camp. It was early November when the first snow began to fall. At first it was a gentle dusting, a light powder that softened the landscape. But soon, the snow thickened, falling in heavy wet flakes that stuck to the ground and each other, piling up around the wagons and choking the narrow mountain pass. They tried to push through. Day after day they struggled against the growing drifts, but the snow was relentless, an unyielding enemy that would not be beaten. They were trapped. They built makeshift shelters, huddling together for warmth, praying for the storm to pass. But the storm did not pass. As the days turned into weeks, the food began to run out. They rationed what little they had, but it was never enough. The game had all but disappeared, and the snowdrifts were too deep to search for any edible plants. Hunger gnawed at their insides, turning their thoughts dark and desperate. One night, as the wind howled outside their cabins, the families gathered together, huddled around the dying embers of their fire. The children were crying, their small voices rising above the wind, a haunting wail that echoed through the trees. The adults spoke in hushed tones, their faces gaunt, eyes hollowed out from hunger and fear. George Donner, ever the leader, stood up, his voice trembling with the weight of the words he was about to speak. "We must make a decision," he said. "If we do not act now, we will not survive this winter." But before he could continue, a loud crash echoed from the forest, the sound of trees snapping like twigs, followed by a blood-curdling scream. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise, their breath caught in their throats. "Was that an animal?" someone whispered, their voice tinged with terror. But George knew better. The scream had been human. They rushed outside, the cold air biting at their skin as they ran toward the sound. The forest was thick with shadows, the moon barely visible through the snow-laden branches. They called out, but there was no answer, only the eerie silence of the woods. And then they saw it, a trail of blood bright against the pure white snow leading deeper into the forest. "Stay back," George warned. But one of the men, desperate to find the source of the scream, ignored him and ran ahead. The rest of the group followed cautiously, hearts pounding in their chests. The trail led them to a small clearing, and what they found there froze the blood in their veins. A man lay in the snow, his body twisted at unnatural angles, his eyes wide open, staring blankly into the sky. His throat had been torn open, the snow around him stained crimson with his blood. But it wasn't the sight of the mutilated body that sent chills down their spines. It was the look of sheer terror frozen on the man's face, as if he had seen something that no human should ever see. The group backed away slowly, their minds racing with questions. What had killed him? And more importantly, was it still out there? George's voice broke the silence, barely more than a whisper. "We need to get back to the camp, now." As they turned to leave, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It was a voice, low and guttural, whispering words that none of them could understand, but that filled their hearts with dread. They ran back to the camp, the wind howling behind them, carrying with it that same terrible whisper. When they reached the safety of their cabins, they barred the doors, bolted the windows, and huddled together, too afraid to sleep, too terrified to speak of what they had seen. But the whisper followed them, seeping through the cracks in the walls, curling around them like a cold mist, wrapping them in its icy embrace. And as the night wore on, the whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it filled their minds with images of things too terrible to comprehend, things that lurked in the dark, waiting for them to close their eyes. The morning after the grisly discovery, the camp was shrouded in an uneasy silence. The sky was a bleak gray, the snow still falling in a relentless sheet. No one spoke of the horror they had witnessed the night before. Instead, they went about their grim tasks with numb hands and hollow eyes, trying to push the memory of that twisted body out of their minds. But the memory refused to leave. It clung to them like the cold, gnawing at their sanity. As the days dragged on, the situation grew more dire. The food was gone, the last of the oxen butchered and eaten, and the children's cries of hunger were growing louder and more desperate. The men were weak, their bodies wasting away from lack of nourishment. But they still took turns trying to hunt, though they knew it was futile. The snow was too deep, the forest too silent. Whatever animals had once roamed these woods had long since fled or died. George Donner was the first to suggest it. The idea came to him one night as he sat by the fire staring into the flames, his mind drifting in and out of clarity. It was as if the thought had been whispered into his ear by the fire itself, a seductive murmur that promised salvation at a terrible price. "Someone has to go," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "We have to send someone to get help." The others looked at him, their eyes sunken and dark, faces gaunt with hunger. They knew what he was suggesting, and the horror of it sent a shiver down their spines. "You mean someone should go alone?" one of the men asked, his voice trembling. George nodded, his gaze still fixed on the flames. "A small group, maybe 3 or 4. They could make it to the settlement on the other side of the pass, bring back food, supplies, save us. But the snow," someone else protested weakly. "It's too deep. They'll never make it." "Then we die here," George replied coldly. "And we'll die soon." The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the crackling of the fire. The decision weighed heavy in the air, a dark cloud hanging over them all. Finally, one man, who had remained quiet throughout the discussion, spoke up. "I'll go," he said, his voice barely audible. The others turned to him in shock. It was William Foster, a man of few words but strong convictions. His wife and children were with the party, and the thought of watching them starve was more than he could bear. "If anyone can make it, I can," he continued, though his voice wavered slightly. "But I'll need others to come with me." A few men hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but 2 eventually volunteered. Charles Stanton, who had always been one of the stronger men in the group, and a young newlywed named Patrick Dolan, who had nothing left to lose. The 3 of them prepared to leave the next morning, bundling up in what little clothing they had left, taking with them the last scraps of food and a small axe. The rest of the group gathered to see them off, their faces pale and drawn with fear and hope. The children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes filled with a terrible understanding. As the men set out, trudging through the snow with slow, laborious steps, the camp grew quiet once more, the oppressive weight of uncertainty pressing down on everyone left behind. Days passed, each one colder and bleaker than the last. The 3 men had been gone for what felt like an eternity, and the hope that they might return was slowly fading away, replaced by an ever-growing despair. Then, one night, as the wind howled outside their cabins and the cold seeped into their bones, they heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making the sound was drawing closer. "Did you hear that?" one of the women asked, her voice trembling as she looked around the cabin, her eyes wide with fear. Everyone froze, their ears straining to catch the faintest sound. At first, there was nothing but the wind, but then they heard it again, unmistakable now. A low, guttural whisper echoing through the trees, curling around the walls of their shelter. The whisper seemed to seep into their minds, filling them with images of shadows moving through the forest, of eyes watching them from the darkness. It was as if the night itself was alive, filled with unseen horrors that were slowly closing in on them, but the terror didn't end there. In the dead of night, one of the children began to scream. The sound was piercing, filled with pure, unadulterated fear. The adults rushed to the child's side, their hearts pounding in their chests. But when they reached him, they found him staring wide-eyed at the window, his small body shaking with terror. "What is it?" one of the mothers asked, her voice a frantic whisper. "What did you see?" The boy didn't answer at first, his eyes still fixed on the window, his breathing ragged and shallow. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice quivering with fear. "There was someone outside, watching us." The adults exchanged horrified glances, their minds racing with the possibilities. Was it one of the men who had gone to find help? Had they returned? But then why hadn't they come inside? The whisper grew louder, wrapping around them like a shroud, filling the cabin with its cold, malevolent presence. The wind outside seemed to grow stronger, rattling the walls, as if something was trying to break in. One of the men, overcome with fear and desperation, grabbed the axe and headed for the door. "I'm going out there," he declared, his voice shaking. "We need to know what's out there." "No!" George Donner shouted, grabbing the man's arm. "We can't afford to lose anyone else!" But the man shook him off, his eyes wild with terror. "I won't stay here and wait to be picked off one by one!" he cried, flinging the door open and stepping out into the night. The cold hit him like a physical force, the wind biting at his exposed skin, but he didn't stop. He stepped out into the snow, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. The forest was silent, the snow falling steadily, muffling any sound. The man called out, his voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. No sign of the men who had left, no sign of anything, until he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, watching him. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs were twisted in a way that no humans should be. The man froze, his blood running cold as he stared at the figure, unable to move or speak. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and the man finally found his voice. He screamed, a scream of pure primal terror that echoed through the forest, waking the others from their uneasy sleep. The scream was cut off abruptly, leaving the forest in an eerie silence. Back in the cabin, the others huddled together, the whisper now a constant presence, like a cold breath on the back of their necks. They waited, eyes wide with fear, but the man did not return. When they finally gathered the courage to go outside, they found only the axe, half buried in the snow, its blade stained with blood. But there was no sign of the man, only a trail of red leading deeper into the forest, and the whisper, now louder than ever, calling them into the darkness. The next morning, fear hung over the camp like a dense fog, suffocating any remnants of hope. The man's disappearance had shaken them to their core, and the sight of the blood-stained axe left no room for doubt. Something malevolent was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The whispers had become a constant presence, no longer just a sound, but a living, breathing entity that seemed to invade their minds, filling them with dark, incomprehensible thoughts. It was as if the cold itself had taken on a voice that was slowly driving them mad. George Donner tried to keep the group together, but he was losing his grip, both on them and on his own sanity. The children cried incessantly, their hunger and fear turning their young faces into hollow masks of despair. The adults were little better, their eyes haunted by the horrors they had witnessed and the terrors they could not name. Then just when they thought things couldn't get worse, it happened. It was late in the afternoon, the sky a dull, lifeless gray, when one of the women, Martha, started to act strangely. She had been sitting by the fire, staring blankly into the flames, when she suddenly stood up, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Martha?" one of the other women called out, concern evident in her voice. But Martha didn't respond. She just kept walking, heading straight for the door. "Where are you going?" George demanded, stepping in front of her, trying to block her path. But Martha's eyes were glazed over, unseeing, her lips moving silently as if she were speaking to someone only she could hear. She pushed past George, her strength surprising, and flung open the door, stepping out into the snow without hesitation. The others rushed to follow her, their hearts pounding in their chests. But by the time they reached the door, Martha was already disappearing into the forest, her figure swallowed by the shadows. "No! We can't let her go out there alone!" one of the men cried, grabbing his coat and preparing to run after her. But George grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Wait!" he shouted. "Listen!" The whisper was louder now, almost deafening. But there was something else beneath it. A faint, desperate voice calling for help. "It's her," one of the women whispered, her voice trembling. "She's calling for help!" But the whispering was louder than ever, drowning out everything else, and soon, the voice was gone. "We have to go after her!" another man shouted, but George shook his head, his face pale and drawn. "No," he said, his voice hollow. "Whatever took her, it's out there, waiting. We can't risk it." But they couldn't just leave her out there, could they? The thought of Martha, alone in the freezing woods, terrified them to their core. Yet something in George's voice, in the deep unsettling calmness in his eyes, made them hesitate. They waited, huddled together in the cabin, the door firmly bolted, but Martha never returned. Her voice, though, it came back, or what was left of it. As the night drew on, they heard it in the whisper, mingled with the other voices, all pleading, all desperate, all lost. "Help me," it said, over and over again, until the words became an incomprehensible chant that wormed its way into their minds, gnawing at their sanity. The hours dragged on, the whispers becoming a cacophony of agony, until finally, someone snapped. It was Patrick Dolan, the young man who had volunteered to leave with the others, but had been too weak to go in the end. He'd been quiet, too quiet, ever since the others left, and now his mind seemed to have fractured entirely. "I can't take it anymore!" he screamed, clutching his head in his hands. "They're all around us! Can't you hear them? They're out there, waiting for us!" George and a few others tried to calm him, but it was no use. Patrick's eyes were wild, his face pale and gaunt, his body trembling uncontrollably. He ran to the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the bolt. "No!" George shouted, grabbing him by the shoulders, trying to hold him back. You'll get yourself killed out there! But Patrick was beyond reason. He shoved George away with a strength born of pure, unbridled terror and threw open the door. The wind howled as it burst into the cabin, the cold so intense it felt like needles piercing their skin. But it wasn't the wind that made them all freeze in place. It was the sight that greeted them outside. Martha stood in the snow, just a few feet from the door. Her clothes were torn, her hair matted with blood, and her skin was an unnatural shade of blue. But it was her eyes that terrified them the most. Eyes that no longer belonged to the woman they had known, but to something else. Something otherworldly. "Martha?" one of the women whispered, but she didn't respond. Instead, she took a step forward, her movement slow, deliberate, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Patrick's screams filled the air as he backed away, stumbling over his own feet in his desperation to escape. But there was nowhere to go. Martha was blocking the door, her lifeless eyes fixed on him. And then, with a speed that was impossible for a human, she lunged at him. The force of her attack sent them both crashing to the ground, and before anyone could react, Martha's teeth sank into Patrick's neck, tearing into flesh and muscle with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the snow, a shocking crimson against the white, and the others watched in horror as Martha feasted on the man's flesh. Her once delicate hands now claws, ripping and tearing at his body with terrifying ferocity. Finally, one of the men, his face contorted with terror, grabbed the axe from where it had been discarded and swung it with all his might at Martha. The blade connected with her back, the sound of breaking bone echoing through the night. But Martha didn't scream, didn't even flinch. Instead, she slowly turned her head, her blood-soaked grin widening, her eyes now completely black, void of any humanity. With a strength that defied logic, Martha grabbed the axe handle and wrenched it out of the man's hands, tossing it aside like it was nothing. And then, as if she had lost interest in Patrick's now lifeless body, she turned her gaze back to the group, her smile growing wider, more grotesque. The man who had swung the axe stumbled back, his face white with terror. The others followed suit, retreating into the cabin, slamming the door shut and barring it with anything they could find. But the sense of safety was fleeting. The whispering, now louder than ever, filled the air around them, wrapping them in an inescapable dread. The cabin felt like a coffin, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on them, suffocating any hope they had left. They knew now that Martha was no longer one of them. She was something else, something far worse than death. Hours passed in unbearable silence, each one stretching on for an eternity. No one dared to move, to speak, as if any noise might draw the attention of whatever was lurking outside. The whispering continued, incessant and maddening, an indecipherable chant that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a loud crash against the door. The group jumped, their hearts pounding in their chests. The crash was followed by another, and then another, each one more forceful, more violent. "She's trying to get in!" one of the women screamed, her voice filled with sheer panic. George rushed to the door, his hands trembling as he tried to brace it with his body. The others hurried to help, piling what little furniture they had against it. But the force on the other side was relentless. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Silence fell over the cabin once again, but it was even more terrifying than the noise had been. They stood frozen, listening, their breaths coming in short, terrified gasps. For a moment it seemed as though they might have been safe. But then, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. It filled their ears, their minds, their very souls with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then they heard it. The sound of something scratching at the walls. It started as a soft, almost gentle noise, but it quickly grew louder, more frenzied, as if whatever was out there was trying to claw its way inside. The group huddled together, their fear reaching a fever pitch. The scratching grew louder, faster, more desperate. The sound seemed to come from all directions, as if the cabin itself was under siege by a horde of unseen monsters. George looked around, his eyes wild with fear, searching for any means of escape. But there was nowhere to go. The cabin was surrounded by darkness, the forest outside a maze of terror. They were trapped. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The group waited, their bodies tense, their breath caught in their throats. And then from outside the cabin they heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling out to them. "Help me," it whispered, the sound barely audible over the howling wind. It was a voice they recognized, a voice that had once been filled with warmth and life. It was Martha. The group looked at each other, their faces pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. How could it be? They had seen what she had become, what she had done. Yet the voice was unmistakable. Martha was out there, calling for help. "No, it's not her," George whispered, his voice trembling. "It can't be, it's a trick. It's trying to lure us out." But the voice continued, growing louder, more desperate. "Please, help me, I'm cold. I'm so cold!" One of the men, unable to bear it any longer, moved toward the door. "We can't just leave her out there," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "What if it's really her? What if she's still alive?" George grabbed his arm, his grip firm. "Don't," he said, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and anger. "That thing out there isn't Martha anymore. It's something else. It's using her voice to get to us." The man hesitated, torn between fear and compassion. But the voice outside grew even more pitiful, more heart-wrenching. "Please, I don't want to die out here." Finally, the man wrenched his arm free from George's grasp and flung open the door. The cold wind rushed in, extinguishing the fire and plunging the cabin into darkness. The man stepped outside, his eyes scanning the shadowy forest, searching for any sign of Martha. But the forest was silent, still, as if holding its breath. The man called out her name, his voice echoing through the trees. "Martha, where are you?" There was no response, only the eerie silence of the night. The man took a few cautious steps forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Martha?" he called again, his voice trembling. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the shadows, moving toward him with unnatural speed. The man's breath caught in his throat as he recognized her. Martha, her face pale, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into that same grotesque grin. She reached out to him, her fingers curling around his arm with a grip that was impossibly strong. "You shouldn't have come out here," she whispered, her voice cold and devoid of any emotion. The man screamed, trying to pull away, but it was too late. Martha's grip tightened, and she pulled him closer, her mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, blood-stained teeth. With a sickening crunch, she bit down on his neck, tearing into his flesh with savage hunger. Back inside the cabin, the others listened in horror as the man's screams echoed through the night. George slammed the door shut, barring it once again, his heart pounding with fear and guilt. He knew there was nothing they could do. Nothing except wait for the inevitable. The whispering outside grew louder, more insistent, until it filled their minds with thoughts too terrible to comprehend. Shadows danced at the edges of their vision, twisting into grotesque shapes, faces that were not quite human. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell. The whispering continued, relentless, gnawing at their sanity. The scratching at the walls resumed, more frantic than before, as if the very cabin was being torn apart from the outside. Finally, the door burst open and the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the stench of death. The group huddled together, their bodies trembling with fear as they watched in horror. Figures moved through the doorway, twisted and deformed, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were tall, unnaturally so, their limbs elongated and misshapen. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but their mouths twisted into grotesque grins as they advanced on the terrified survivors. "Martha?" one of the women whispered, her voice trembling with fear and disbelief. But it wasn't just Martha. There were others, dozens of them, moving silently through the snow, their eyes fixed on the group huddled inside the cabin. The realization hit them all at once, a wave of pure, unbridled terror. The figures were the men and women who had gone missing, transformed into something else, something far worse than death. They had become part of the darkness, the hunger that had consumed them now driving them to consume others. George tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their grins widening, their hands reaching out with inhuman strength. One by one, the survivors fell, their screams echoing through the night, their bodies torn apart by the ravenous horde. In his final moments, as the darkness closed in around him, George saw something that made his blood run cold. Behind the figures, watching silently from the shadows, were even more twisted shapes. Things that had never been human. Things that had been waiting in the darkness long before the Donner Party had arrived. And they were hungry. The dawn broke cold and gray over the Sierra Nevada, the snow-covered forest silent and still. The camp was empty now, the cabins standing as mute sentinels to the horrors that had unfolded there. There was no sign of the Donner Party, no sign of the bloody struggle that had taken place. All that remained were the whispers, carried on the wind, echoing through the trees, a haunting reminder of the fate that had befallen them. And somewhere, deep in the forest, the figures moved silently through the snow, their black eyes watching, waiting, always hungry. The Donner Party had become a part of them now, and the hunger would never end.